This episode is sponsored by Team Builder, yet another company that's doing great things for the first responder community. As a strength and conditioning coach myself who also trains tactical athletes, dissemination of wellness information is one of the biggest challenges. Now, Team Builder is the premier strength and conditioning software for tactical athletes, and there are several features that really impress me. Firstly, there is a full exercise library, so you, the personal trainer, does not have to create that within your own department. Secondly, you can send out programming, but also individualize, which I love. So you blanket program for everyone. Now you can tweak based on someone's injury, someone's need to maybe drop some body composition, rather than having to write a program for every single person on their own. Team Builder also allows you to build custom questionnaires to collate health and wellness data. It integrates with wearables. And I think one of the most important things is obviously it tracks. To me, it's imperative that we as a profession start tracking our people from day one and then over the full span of their career, therefore catching potential wellness issues and injuries before they happen. Now, if you want to try Team Builder, they are offering you, the audience of the Behind the Shield podcast, a free 14-day trial to experience all of the features. And if you want to take a deeper dive into Team Builder, listen to episode 1032 with Melissa Mercado, or go to teambuilder.com. And I'll spell that to you because it's not as you'd think, teambuildr.com. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show Canadian law enforcement veteran and the man behind Setting My Sights on Stigma, Mark Bouchard. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into policing, tactical medicine, catharsis through writing, sleep, moral injury, and so much more. Now, before I get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of over 1,100 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Mark Bouchard. Enjoy. Well, Mark, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friends at The Collective, Sean and Chance. And secondly, I want to welcome you onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Well, thanks, James. It's a real honor to be here. And yeah, fortunate to have been on that podcast with you. So for any of your listeners, it's worth checking out. And yeah, thank you for having me. Honored to be here.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this morning?
I live in the outskirts of Ottawa, which is the capital for Canada in Ontario.
Brilliant. Well, I would love to start at the very beginning of your timeline, and then we'll progress through to all things mental health and first responder. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings?
Sure. So I was born in a Vancouver suburb. So up in Canada, but it's on the far west coast for anyone who's not familiar. It's in a suburb called Delta. I'm the fourth child. My parents, they run an accounting company. My dad still does. He's about to turn 78, still just loves helping people save money on their taxes. Nothing gets him more excited than that. And my mom worked there for a long time. My brother works there. I come from a whole family of accountants. I don't know how I managed to become a cop, but somehow found quite a different profession. So yeah, I'm the fourth kid. I actually also have an adopted brother, not in the same way a lot of people would. It's his mother died from cancer when we were fairly young, and just was a bit of a lost kid wandering around the neighborhood. Would come to our house a lot. So yeah, he basically became my brother. He was the best man at our wedding. So actually, I'm getting a bit emotional about that.
Oh, good. I mean, this is a beautiful story. So reverse engineering. What was it about your parents and maybe even their upbringing that gave them the kind of compassion to bring in the child of someone who'd lost their mother?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my mother's mother, my grandmother, very much brought people in like that. And it's actually my uncle married my aunt, and she was someone who they had brought in. My mom's mom. They lived in North Vancouver. So I think my mom came by that a bit naturally, and she had been friends with Barb. Barb is Duncan's mom, who died. So my adopted brother Duncan, his mother passed away from cancer, and his birthday, my birthday, and Mother's Day are all within a week. So he kind of just kept coming around the house more and more, and then eventually I started calling him my brother, and next thing you know, he'd come out to everything, like all our family photos, and we'd go on family trips, and he was coming to everything. And I'm very, very fortunate. I think he was a bit of a lost kid for a little while, like struggled in high school. And I think in a way it was, so we were kind of helping him at the time, but then I ended up going through my own hard time, and he was one of the best supports, and even like I say, he was best man at my wedding, because just developed this awesome relationship. He was almost like a little brother for me in a way, even though he's 2 years older and he's 6'6". He's kind of a big brother too, but yeah, pretty fortunate for that. And I think my parents just are kind of those giving people who try and help in the community, and they're part of Rotary and part of like just trying to find ways to contribute. And I think they saw, just created a nice place, and then where Duncan felt safe, just kept coming, and then developed a great relationship from there that we're all fortunate for.
I think just that whole philosophy is something that we need to refind as society. I think it was there for a long time, tribally, and then even if you look at a lot of smaller communities, villages and towns around the world, where they say it takes a village. It's not just one family left to fend for themselves, and if another family's doing better, well, I earned this, and screw you. And going back to this, as they say, you want to change the world, start at home, and then step outside your front door and reach out to your community. If we all did that, we would see such a global change as far as, not only kindness and compassion, but also crime and addiction and all the other things.
Yeah, it's connection, it's meaning, it's belonging, right? I think we don't really get taught those things growing up and as kids. We have this perception that we just need to make a lot of money and be successful and have status, and then we'll be happy. And like I wrote a bit about suicide in that chapter of my book, and I lost a loved one to suicide, which was my godfather, Bill. And Bill, had millions of dollars, and Bill died from a suicide. Right? We don't talk about that, especially in relation to men. So I hear you. And for me, like getting into law enforcement and then into like SWAT, or emergency response work, we call it in Canada, that connection, that brotherhood, that bond, really it's the intensity of the experiences that you go through. And that's what love is, right? You build this really intense bond. And when you go through something like a war or these really intense things, you have that brotherhood. And there's guys where, I worked with them and got super close, and we might not talk for a year or two, but when you see them, when you talk to them, it's just like you haven't missed a beat. And that's what they say. Hey, this is just like seeing my best friends from high school, my best friends I grew up with. And I don't know about you, but is that what your experience has been like with fire as well? That same kind of tight knit brotherhood, or I shouldn't say brotherhood, sisterhood too. But I mean, in ERT work, we have very few women. It's largely men. That's why I often would say brotherhood. But what's your experience been, James?
Yeah, no, it has. I mean, throughout my career, but especially Anaheim, California, that crew, really was the most cohesive, tight knit group in an extremely in the kind of department that sets the bar extremely high. So even just making it through the year of probation was, a crucible in itself. And then you start running these calls, and they went to a lot of stuff, a lot of horrible wrecks, a lot of fires. And there were times where, yeah, absolutely, it was in very dangerous situations. And those same men, because my crew in that particular case were all men, 10 years later were my groomsmen at my wedding. And I'd moved 2,500 miles the other side of the country, and they all flew over. So 100%. I mean, if I pick up the phone now, I just talked to my firefighter partner the other day, and it's always just like we just spoke the day before. So I think that shared suffering and that community that we experience in the first responder professions is something that I think the whole world would benefit from.
Yeah, I often cite books because they've helped me so much. There's a book called the The Like Switch by Jack Schaefer. And he describes something called the friendship formula. And there's 4 factors that build friendship: proximity, frequency, intensity, and duration. And I think the huge one there is intensity. Because when you go through something super intense together, like things that involve life and death situations where people have your back. And for me, growing up, that was sports. I played a lot of hockey, and a lot of my best friends are people I grew up playing hockey with because they've had your back. They've been in fights with you. Like, they literally helped save you when you were in a bad spot. And then seeing the evolution of that for me when I got into police work, same thing. You go through really intense things, and it's not always danger. Sometimes it's emotional pain. Sometimes it's the tragic sadness and suffering and death of innocent people or child victims. Like, there can be totally other reasons where the intense experience comes. They aren't just danger. But then I transitioned into what we call in Canada the emergency response team. I did about 10 years there, but it is our SWAT team up here. And same thing. Then you get such intense experiences, and that just forms these bonds. Like, I have so many, what I call best friends for life. And I may not even talk to someone in a year, but I could call them up tomorrow and they do anything for you. Right. And that's to me, that's what life's about. That's a meaningful life. It's a life of purpose, a life of service, a life of connection. And I feel very fortunate to have got those opportunities and to have learned that.
I think that's one of the sad things about the way American sports has devolved. And I mean sports as in what people see on their actual screen. And I've had this conversation a lot. Coming from another country, when I first moved here, I kept meeting all these broken, 25, 30-year-olds with these I coulda, woulda, shoulda dreams. I call them my Uncle Ricos. And it's not to make fun of them. It's just, it's like, how did you go from such a high level of performance in high school and college to now be broken and overweight and kind of beat down? And it's because the focus was on winning. And yes, of course, when you are in, for example, I've always been a martial artist. I don't want to go in there and just drop my hands and get my head knocked off. I want to win. But it's the crucible that you go through with your team or with your martial arts team that you fight side by side with, whatever it is. That's actually where the value is. And the laughing and the joking. And when you fall over, all the things together. And we've kind of discarded that and say, oh, no. The only thing that matters is if you stand on the podium. That's it. And I could not disagree more. Of course, trying to win is the biggest, element. But how many teams have won every NHL, Stanley Cup, every Super Bowl? Of course, only one team. And you're discrediting all the hard work and all the support staff and everything else that goes into that. So the huge takeaway from sports is, humility, teamwork, community, shared suffering. It's not whether you got a gold circle on a ribbon.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I often think of like outcome-based decision-making, where it's just like, well, that outcome happened. We won or we didn't win. Therefore, I'm happy or unhappy. I played on some basically like championship teams. So we won provincials for hockey 3 times, won Westerns. And one year we went right to the overtime of the gold medal game and we lost. I couldn't stop crying. I was devastated. It was my last year, 20 years old. We'd won it in the past and we didn't win at that time. And after being upset that day, I've never been upset about it again because we got every game we could have got. We got this amazing experience together. That's what it was really about, was the bond and the brotherhood and the friends for life that it helped create. It wasn't just about the championship kind of represents the experience, not so much defines you. And back to kind of how that evolved into my police time. I just saw my job, like I was excited every day to try and get better. Like I felt like I owed that to both the people we serve, but also really to those people around me. Because you go through these intense things, things like, yeah, there's lots of just regular days where nothing crazy happens. But when something's going to happen, it's either you prepared for it and you're ready and you can actually do what you need to do or you didn't. And that's one thing I really value of what you bring, James, is you set that high bar. You basically say, hey, we should be like athletes. We should take this serious. We should hold ourselves accountable, not just take it easy because we can today because nothing's coming in. Well, that means get training, get physical, like do all those things ahead of time. It's like the will to win and the will to prepare to win, right? Everyone wants to win when it's game day. Everyone wants to win when that moment comes. The question is, did you actually prepare for it so that you're ready for that moment and you can be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned about being the son of 2 accountants. So as you were progressing through the school years, were you dreaming of law enforcement or was there something else in your mind?
No, I just want to be a hockey player. I'll be honest with you. I had dreams of the NHL. I'm only 5'10", so that was probably never going to happen. Um, and my mom worked there, but she was more like the receptionist, so she wasn't like a full blown like CA, CPA accountant. No, and you know what I always said when people would ask me, "Do you want to be an accountant like your dad?" I would say, "No, I don't want to work that much." And not to sound weird about it, but like I watched my dad put in 100-hour work weeks all the time. And it's not that, there's lots of accountants who don't, right? That's fair. But he ran his own business. So I think part of that was actually the entrepreneur side. They say entrepreneurs are only people working 80 hours a week so they don't have to work 40. So he, if you're not putting in the work, the income's not coming in. And he has a lot of people that work there, so they all get paid before you do. So there's times when there's not a whole lot left, right? There's good times and hard times. So no, I had this mindset. I didn't want to work that much. And what I had seen was the impact of crime. So my dad's business has been broken into more times than I can count. And they'd always find a new way. They'd cut a hole from the neighboring business. They'd come in through the ceiling. They drove a truck through the front of the business. They did tens of thousands of dollars of damage, and they stole 2 flat screen monitors. They'd steal vehicles from the parking lot. And it was so angering for me, like very upsetting. To the point my parents would be sleeping in the office sometimes to try and prevent people from breaking in and stealing things. And then really you just want to do something about it. And then I went to university, I got a poli-sci degree, and then you find out no one really wants to pay you to political science, certainly not pay you well. And then you look around at what to do. And I liked the idea of being physical and doing something different every day and just trying to find a way to help people. And that's, I think, a common theme of what I've seen even as a recruiter within policing. I've sat in on recruiting interviews. And so often everyone comes in, why do you want to be a cop? I want to help people. And I think sometimes that can get a little bit lost. But that was my way of trying to find a way to help. And then after doing it, what I learned is those doing the job needed a lot of help. And I say that because I lived it, like many of us. And then as I healed and started getting better, I looked around at all my buddies and I'm like, man, there's so many of us really suffering. And then became the new mission, is how do you help the helpers?
It's funny. I remember when I was testing to be a firefighter, we're talking 2004. I was very competitive back then. I've talked about this a lot. What you could learn about the profession on the internet was very, very limited. And there was one site, I think it was called the Golden Nuggets, where it would kind of teach you how to ace your interview, air quotes. And they said, if you get asked, why do you want to be a firefighter? Don't say, I want to help people. And it's funny because when I reflect back now, that's exactly why. I don't need to pull some story, because I was actually ironically in a fire when I was 4. So I could have pulled that ever since then. I was, practicing to be a firefighter. That's bullshit. I just want to help people. I don't want people to feel pain. I don't want people to die when it was preventable. The end, period. I shouldn't have to zhuzh that up for some interview. And so it was almost discouraged to use that as a response. And it's a shame because, as you said, ultimately, most of us get into this job simply because they want to make the world a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think that's important for us to help educate the public on, because I even say specifically for policing, I think policing has a little more challenges with public perception. Like, and I mean, one of the topics I write about and I even like do my presentations about is lethal force psychology, because it's really hard to wrap our heads around how we're this kind, giving person. We sign up to help people. We want to be a cop. And that's what we see at a community event. And then you end up in this no-win situation where your life's in danger and someone else's life's in danger, and you're even forced to use lethal force. And then you're left with this pain because of how big our resistance is to doing it. And then you're labeled in the media sometimes as, even like you would have seen in my book, but one of my best friends was charged with murder after shooting a hostage taker. Like, it never should have happened. But society is so much like we're disconnected from our food source, from our fitness and our health in some ways. We're disconnected from our protection. We think that, violence is bad. Violence is bad. But if you're doing violence to keep innocent people safe, then actually maybe it's this weird way that it's actually a good thing today. You're being a protector or guardian. You're not using violence for a bad way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because depending on which news station you watch, either A, police are all racist and they're just waiting for the opportunity to kill someone of color, or every single police shooting is justified, and obviously the truth is in the middle. Of course, there are some bad apples in the profession, but most people, I don't think that people understand like the ripple effect of being an officer-involved shooting on the officer themselves, because they did not wake up that morning saying, "Ooh, I hope I shoot someone today."
Yeah, there's a book called Shots Fired by Chuck Ryland. There's actually a bunch of great books on lethal force psychology, but in that one specifically, they follow, I think it's about 10 or 12 officers after their shooting. So they chronicle a little bit of the experience of the officer of the event, but largely it follows them after. And basically all their lives fall apart. Many of them, several of them end up suicidal. They're sitting there contemplating killing themselves and largely feel super misunderstood, both in the media by their loved ones, and just how emotionally painful it can be. And I know officers who've been through shootings, and sometimes they're okay, and sometimes, for whatever reason, doesn't impact them in that way. But for many, I've talked to some who have hit the point of, suicidal ideation and just really life falling apart for them. And that's where, as a profession, I think we in policing, much like you're trying to change fire profession and fire culture, we need to change our culture to start teaching this early. Don't wait until someone's already injured and off work and sending them to rehab. Like, yes, let's have those supports when we need them. But what if we actually taught you this at the start of your career? Much like you talk so much about sleep and wellness and all kinds of these good things that if we can teach people, we can prevent things from getting so bad 10 years later by having you have these healthy thoughts, habits, et cetera, early on. And that's where we need to get within the policing profession. There's a ton of great books out there. And it's part of why I've started doing little book summaries on my website and on a YouTube channel. It's just trying to help share that knowledge within the profession. And my hope is that one day we'll actually teach a bunch of those. Say like a great book like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It's a fantastic book on trauma. For any of those in trauma exposed professions like first responders, like you need to be able to learn how to heal yourself, how to take care of yourself after these traumatic events. And what if we taught it to you right at the start of your career in the course curriculum? Even sleep science, like a book like Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker, fantastic book that will really help you. So if those are issues someone out there that's listening to this is struggling with a little bit, grab those books and they'll help you.
Before we go into your journey in law enforcement and start unpacking all these elements that we just discussed, when you reflect back now, what were the contributing factors to so much crime in the neighborhood that you grew up in the business that your dad was trying to protect?
Wow, that's a big question. I think the drug trade is a central aspect, right? So, I mean, just in my own experience since then, like your average person is not going out doing crime. These random people are not just going down the street, breaking into cars, breaking into businesses. And from my experience, pretty much universally, those who are addicted to drugs. They're caught up in a cycle within the drug trade where they owe a lot of money and now they need to do crime to be able to get that money, but they don't have it. So what do? They steal things from your car, your garage, they break into your business, and that's how they get their money. Now, to take a step back even further in the cycle, why are they doing all those drugs? And often I would say there's a massive issue around pain. Many of them, it's neglect, it's childhood abuse, it's sexual abuse. Like when you really sit down and listen to people who are addicted to drugs, is often there's a story behind what got them there. And that's one thing I'll say from reading your book. I really sensed a lot of compassion and empathy. It's how do we relate to this person? How do we actually feel a little piece of their pain and then connect with them to try and help them? And that's what I would try and do. Even like I would arrest a drunk driver. Now, alcohol, drugs, similar, slightly different, but many of them, it's just extreme pain. They've lost a parent, they've lost a child, and they don't know how to cope. And especially as men, then they have this shame around, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm crying. They'll be like, I don't know why I'm being such a little bitch. And I'm like, you're not, you're being human. Right. And I would literally just try and sit down with them and be that space and also say like, hey man, what's going to happen is you keep doing this, you're going to have killing someone else's kid. And I don't want you to have to live with that. And I don't want to be my kid or your kid or anyone else's kid. Like, let's try and get you some help. And there were times people would thank me. Like literally you arrest them for drunk driving. And at the end of the day, they're thanking you. And that's the same thing I would try and do when I would arrest someone for property crime and they're drug addicted, is I would just say, hey man, I'd much rather be trying to put my time into getting you help than just throwing you in jail, right? Like at the end of the day, until we can fix the issue of the drugs, you're likely not getting away from this lifestyle of crime. And for many of them, it's very hard. And I would say, hey, it might take you 7 attempts of going to rehab. It might take you 12. That's okay. Let's start with number 1 right now. Let's start you on a path towards better. And let's look at a long-term solutions of the problem, not just trying to deal with this today and just blaming you like, you're the only only source of the issue here?
This is always an interesting question to ask anyone in law enforcement because they were told to enforce drug prohibition laws. But a quick backstory, I think I've talked about this for a little while now. When I started my podcast, my mom had actually said, "Hey, did you know what they did about drug prohibition here in Portugal?" Because she moved to Portugal about 25 years ago now. And she goes, "Yeah, they basically had a national vote. It was spearheaded by this one doctor. And they said, look, we've tried this whole arrest the addicts model from America. It doesn't seem to be working." They had this massive epidemic of addiction after one of the wars in a Portuguese colony in Africa. And the soldiers came back addicted to opiates, and it kind of spread through the country. And so they were like, look, we want to try something different. And Portugal is a really interesting country because it's very small. It's kind of almost looked down on by some of the more well-known Mediterranean countries, if you like. But at their core, they're actually very progressive, or if you want to look at a different way, they've stayed attached to more traditional values, more tribal values. And so the country voted yes. And what they did is they poured all their resources into mental health counseling, the creation of mental health counseling, addiction counseling, job creation, housing, and it was fully funded. So not this piecemeal where we see in the US or in Canada, we just decriminalize, but that was it. We just don't arrest them now. We didn't give them any resources. And Portugal saw such a success. They went from the highest addiction rate to the lowest in less than 10 years. And what that did for law enforcement then was, of course, it reduced crime, but then it allowed all the resources that they had to go after the dealers and the smugglers. And the court system was freed up so they could process those people fast and get them behind bars if needed. So to me, and I sat down with his name, João Goulão, with that doctor that spearheaded it. I sat down in Lisbon a few years ago, and then we just did one about 6 months ago again. And to me, that is the solution. We have to stop arresting addicts, like you said, people that are just drowning in pain. It's totally socially acceptable to down a bottle of scotch, but God forbid you have, an illicit drug, then you're a scumbag, according to our laws. So with all that monologue aside, I'm not trying to load the question, your response. What is your philosophy on the war on drugs as we've known it for the last few decades, and any proactive solutions that can change this?
Well, let me start with an analogy. Just think about if you could make a place where you had full control of everything. You build giant walls, you put up fencing, control who comes in and out, you search everybody, and now you still can't keep drugs out of there, right? Let's be honest, that's jail, and people can still get drugs in and out and use drugs in there. So we're kidding ourselves if we think we're heading to a drug-free society. And we do need to relook at some of it, but it needs to be done in a smart way. And I will say in Canada, I think we've gone a little bit too much towards decriminalize, legalize, all that kind of stuff without what you said about the supports. Because it's really sad to see people addicted to drugs where it's just, we'll give you all the free drugs you want. And we have stuff around giving out, free morphine, and then it just makes its way back onto the market being sold by drug dealers. And I know anecdotal examples of people telling me about they get their drugs from their doctor and then they go and sell them to their drug dealer because they want the fentanyl. They want the higher drug that we're trying to keep them from that is more deadly. But it's also informed from those anecdotal experiences of speaking to people addicted to drugs. And I will say, we end up getting these cards we're supposed to hand out to people addicted to drugs about destigmatizing drug use. And I remember as I started trying to do it, and people who are addicted to drugs would say to me, yeah, this isn't a good plan. And I'm like, when the drug addict and the cop both think it's a bad plan, it's probably not going to work very well. And it's not that we want to destigmatize drug use. We want to increase their access, to help, right? To have the supports there that they can go take. And would we rather pay for, mental health treatment and housing and all those kind of things that are going to come as costs and upfront costs? Or would you rather pay the long-term cost of having your business broken into again and your things stolen out of your garage and all those kind of problems that are going to come with it? So I'm like you, I believe in a society where we take care of each other. And some people might call that socialism. I think there's this balance between capitalism and socialism where it's not meant to just be me out for me. It's meant to be that I have responsibility to my community and to take care of others. And I think there is no easy answer, but I do believe in funding some of those kind of holistic approaches of how we can help people. And I will say there's also some people that probably never able to get off. Like even just from talking to them, they can't function in life, and they've probably done 20 to 30 years worth of damage to their brain. Like they may never be able to go back to just a normal functioning member of society. So the plan needs to include people like that are going to struggle to function on their own no matter what. And again, there's no easy answer to these things, but that view from the inside, which, I think you've had some from your fire experience as well. It's a different picture than just blaming someone. And we're not trying to make excuses for any kind of bad behavior happening, but let's look at systemic level solutions of how do we make this better.
I forget what the current prison rate is, but I know in the 70s, I think it was a few 100,000, and now we're in several million. And America, we're talking about the US, America makes up 4% of the world's population and has almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So again, like if we're just crunching numbers, if that worked, then there would be a relationship between prohibition and, incarcerated people. Because as you said, a lot of people that are behind bars are related to, in some way, shape or form, some sort of drug. And then even we have this Doge thing going on at the moment, where supposedly they're analyzing all the wastage in government. We have a lot of prisons that make a lot of money by having prisoners. Some of them are private prisons. So if you're going to look at wastage, then there is no greater wastage than taking someone who potentially could pay tax and instead make the rest of the nation pay for them to be behind bars for 10, 20, 30 years. So even from a fiscal point of view, it benefits the nation when you allow someone to heal. Like you said, not everyone will be able to do it, but a majority get them rehabilitated, get them back to work, and now they're tax-paying citizens. So it's no matter how you look at it, every single angle, changing the way we do it has to be front and center. And to have this, again, with the stigma too, it was interesting with Portugal, when they decriminalized it and they gave all these support mechanisms, so they showed their people, no, we actually want you to get better. The addict now wasn't afraid of being arrested. So then they were able to ask for help. And then they were able to get help. And then there was job creation and housing. And now they're truly put back on their feet again. And everyone listening now, it's a perfect example, the perfect word, stigma, because how many people are afraid to reach out about how they're dealing with their own mental health, alcohol, drugs, or just simple, depression because of the stigma. So we live that stigma. So imagine being an addict in an area where it's illegal. I mean, there's so many people that wear our uniform that are struggling with addiction. So if we don't even have compassion for our own police officers and firefighters and paramedics and soldiers who are battling addiction, then we sure as shit aren't going to care about the average person. So, the only way that, in my opinion, that we turn this around is we look at the addict the way that it should be looked at, as a patient, as someone who's hurting, whether it's a broken pelvis or a crippling addiction. And we encircle them in the medical community. We give them support that they need. And as you said, there will be some people that will slip through the cracks. But this is something that we seem to love doing in the West, is we point at the one person it didn't work for and go, see, it doesn't work, and turn our heads to the 99 or whatever percentage of people that it did work for. So I think the stigma word is so important because our community understands what it's like to be pushed in the shadows because of stigma, and that applies to addiction and the regular people too.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I think with stigma too, the more I've obviously got a chapter about it on my book, and I given a lot of thought to stigma. And I think self-stigma is such a key part. It certainly was for me. I think when we talk about removing stigma and reducing stigma, it's a lot easier to look at stigma when it's about someone else. Oh, that person's having a hard time. Oh, okay, yeah. I hope they're okay and I wish them well and all that kind of stuff. It's so much harder to wrap our heads around giving ourselves permission to have a hard time. And just understanding, for me, I had this idea that I needed to be RoboCop, that I put on a police hat and I wasn't human anymore. And one of my examples after we had this bad fatal car crash and I did the next of kin and I was at scene for several hours and I saw a recruit from my recruit class the next day and he asked me about it and I started tearing up. And this is probably about 2009. And he said, like, what's wrong with you? Nothing was wrong with me. I was a human having a normal emotional reaction to an incredibly tragic event, but I didn't understand it. He didn't understand it either. So no judgment on him either. But how do we teach that so that we can make it normal for our fire recruits, police recruits? And honestly, can we start teaching it in high school? Can we start teaching kids? Like, you know who needs this the most? Men, right? How many men do you know that have unhealthy relationships with emotion? Like, no one can ever see me cry. No one can ever know I cry. I don't have emotion. And it's like, the number of times I've talked to suicidal men as a police officer, and they're shaming themselves so much because they feel emotion for sadness and hardship they've gone through, when that's just part of being human. And I think when we disconnect from some of those things, we also disconnect from the good. Like, so, and it's like part of my story, but like my dad, I used to say to him, like, it was hard for me. When I was 20, I first told my parents I love them. That was hard for me. I was afraid to do that. That sounds weird to say now, but that was my reality. I was so scared to tell them I love them. And for 10 years, if I said to my dad, Dad, I love you, he'd say, I know. And then I'd say, hey, Dad, when someone says I love you too, or I love you, you're supposed to say I love you too. And he'd go, okay. Because that's how hard that was for him as a 60-year-old man. Never told his kids he loved them. Couldn't even say I love you too. That's not healthy. That's not good. And to kind of bring back into some of my story, as I went through my own hard time, I was off work on stress leave. I failed a psych exam. Like, I got really impacted. And my dad phoned me one day to tell me he loved me. And that's the good that came out of the bad. And what I often say is we kind of need to integrate the experiences we go through, because I've seen a lot of death and sadness and bad things in the world. And what I do to make it make sense in my world is I go call my dad and tell him I love him every day, or what, not quite every day, but fairly often, both my parents, because one day I won't get to. And that has brought more good into my life, the good that's come from the bad. And like today, I tell my kids how much I love them. I tell them every day. My son even said that to me. Why do you tell me you love me so much? Like, well, because I do. It's also that I grew up in a house where I had a dad who couldn't tell me he loved me. So maybe I'm overcompensating, but that's to me a little bit of how if you're going to be a first responder, frontline, long-term, you're going to see some hard things, and you got to find a way, not just to repress it, compartmentalize it, and carry that pain around, but to integrate it into who you are and find ways to learn from it, grow from it, and not just suffer from it.
We talked about obviously the kind of pseudo adoption of your brother, and kind of jumped into the kindness and compassion. When you reflect on your early years, knowing that our childhood experiences can absolutely contribute to the fracture of our foundation if left unaddressed, if they're negative, what, if any, were the downside, some of the struggles of your early life? And then if you go back another generation, have you been able to see a relationship between the way your parents were raised?
Yeah. So I actually think I had a really positive childhood. And everyone has their own challenges that they go through. I had loving, supporting parents. My mom was a stay-at-home mom till I was basically, I think, finishing elementary school. My dad worked a ton, so he wasn't always there, but he did his best. He coached me a bit. He did come to some things. My dad loved me. He just couldn't tell me he loved me. And I was in a home where I felt loved. It just wasn't something that was talked about. And I think that has impacted some of those other members of my family. Some of my siblings struggled with some of those kind of things, being able to say it and whatnot. And when I look back to some of their upbringings, well, they had even more siblings, right? My dad had a whole whack of siblings. I think he had 6 siblings. And then his dad had like 13 siblings. So how much room do you have? And how hard was life back then? How different was life? Like, I often ask my dad about what life was like. They had 1 bath a week. You got shipped out to like boarding school away from your family, right? Like you see your grandparents twice ever in your entire life. instead of this world where we have FaceTime every day and airplanes taking us. Like, it was an absolutely different reality. I would also say the mental models around what a man was. A man didn't show, and I've seen it. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I've seen it where someone's yelling at them. They're 6 or 4 or whatever, and like, what's wrong with you? Boys don't cry. Stop crying. Like, that's the kind of stuff that programs us for later in life. When I'm talking to that often suicidal male as a frontline police officer, and they're saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm crying. And I'm like, because you're human, because you're in pain. Just because you can't see it like your broken arm doesn't mean it's not the exact same pain. And just that shaming yourself only makes it worse.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. Like, it'd be really interesting to go back in time to be like, where did boys don't cry come from? Because the first thing we do when we're born is cry. You know what I mean?
That's a good point.
And then you get all these manly men that are playing, that win the Stanley Cup or the World Cup or the NFL, and they're in tears and they're hugging each other. Or the ones that lost, they're in tears. We're not saying, oh, suck it up, stop being a bitch, lineman 12. We're okay with that. So there's it's a complete facade. Yeah, of course, you graze your knee and you cry every time. You might have to work on your pain tolerance a little bit. And then every time you smell a flower and you burst into tears, maybe there's some underlying stuff that, needs to be worked on because you seem like extremely, sensitive. And maybe you need to lay off the testosterone because your estrogen's gone through the roof. But, overall, yeah, I mean, to shame someone to just be tapping into a human emotion is ridiculous. And you talked about that kind of RoboCop thing. I've said this about identity in the fire service. We were raised in similar generations, and it was. I mean, literally, RoboCop, Rambo, Stallone. I mean, Schwarzenegger. These stone-faced bodybuilder actors were supposedly what men were, and that's bullshit. They were bodybuilders. That read lines off a page. I'm not saying they're bad people, but they didn't represent a real human being in those movies. And so then you go into uniform. And then, you see some of these salty guys in your profession, and you're like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be. Don't cry, stone-faced, this fake stoicism. But then you come out the other end, and instead of the yin-yang, now you're a white circle. And like I said, the reason why most of us went into this profession is because we actually care about people. And then you get in, and then you have this compassion fatigue, and it's kind of, ground out of you to actually show caring. And then you come out the other end, you wonder why these retirees are so lost, because they've been led to believe that a real man is, oh, I'm a cop, I'm a firefighter. No, you're not. You're Steve or Jennifer, who became a cop, became a firefighter. But you were a yin and a yang, and that soft, kind, compassionate part of you that put you into uniform, you can't let go of that. And as you come out the other end, you've got to understand that you're still that same kind, considerate person. And I think that's where there's that real confusion in the mental health space, is because now that loss of identity, once people retire or transition out, that white circle is a complete delusion. You're not, but you didn't allow yourself to feel the very emotions that we're talking about. Boys do cry.
Yeah. And when we try to be someone who doesn't, it almost is a bigger weight we add onto ourselves. So if you're undergoing that pain, say you lose a loved one or whatnot, and then you add on that layer of shame of what's wrong with me? How can I be so weak? That's the kind of stuff, or even just more like explicit versions of that. Back to the whole, like, where the boys don't cry comes from and that mindset. I think it's often insecurity. Like, I think there's an element of like what we think we're supposed to be, and it's just out of alignment with our biology, with how we've evolved. And it's not good for us. But so often I think it takes actual confidence to just be yourself. And I don't care. Yeah, I cry about some things and stuff impacts me, and that's fine. I'm a man, and I have zero. If anyone doesn't like it, I don't care. That's their problem, not mine. Right. And it took me years, literally years of repeating to myself, I don't have anything to be ashamed of. I haven't done anything wrong, before I finally believed it. And part of why I wrote my book was my hope was to spread that out to other people. Like, I spent years trying to teach it to myself. And is there a way to then shorten that learning curve and pass it on to others? The other thing that you mentioned, talked a bit about retirement. And I think what happens, just my own take a little bit with retirement, we lose some of the identity, as you were saying. We also lose some of the connection, Because it used to be this big thing. I'm Mark, I'm a cop. There's a book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. It's a fantastic book, but he basically says how the police identity takes over our life. So when I got hired, I was Mark and I was a hockey coach and I'm all these things. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm whatnot. And then those get pushed out and my police identity just starts to take over. And I would suspect there's comparable with things like fire and military and other professions. So when we leave, we lose that sense of identity. We have to re-find it. We have to find a new identity. And we lose some of that connection, belonging, meaning. But we're often still left with some of the downside. We're still left sometimes with some of the trauma, right? You're still having nightmares or having the impacts of traumatic events, but you lose some of that protective buffer, which can even be another risk factor to take on.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned about the crime in Delta. You ended up becoming a Delta police officer. So walk me through your journey through the door of law enforcement and how you started seeing the other side of your community.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I mean, I didn't really grow up around drugs or drug addicts or any of that. And like I was in training, I was a couple months on the job and I ran into multiple people that I knew growing up, people that were like a roommate at a hockey road trip. And now they're drug addicted and in crime every day. And now it's my job to chase them around, arrest them, try and convince them to stop, and ultimately often chase them out of town. That's what we do. We just dislocate crime. I'm going to bother you enough until you leave and you move somewhere else. And we try and find a way to drop you off at your mom's house instead of your dad's so that you're not in our town, right? So it was a real eye opener to just get exposed to the drug world, the drug culture, to just see the town differently. I've had files where you're writing a warrant, you're kicking in the biggest crime house in town, where often the drugs and property crime is so interconnected. And actually the way I usually got in was frauds, right? They'd pass fraudulent currency or things like that, set up identity fraud, cell phones, and most of them aren't very smart about it. But we don't really even investigate most of it. We don't have the resources. We have to prioritize. We prioritize violent crime, sexual assaults, all that stuff, murders. And some of the frauds often, it's not violent. We just make it go away. So that was kind of my road. Why I started investigating a lot of frauds. And then it got me some awesome files. Like, actually you'd go shut down the biggest crime house in town. You'd find drugs, you'd find stolen property, you'd find guns, prostitution, like all that stuff would be coming out of that same central hub. So if you can shut that down, you can try and help your community become safer. So seeing that, I would say the other one was like impaired driving, drunk driving. I've obviously, sadly, I'm sure you've seen some too, but saw the impacts. Like we actually changed the laws here in British Columbia, where I was living in Vancouver area. There was a young girl who was struck by a drunk driver. And it was my old patrol watch that had taken that call. It was shortly before I joined the watch, but they passed a law to change the drunk driving laws to make it a lot easier for the police. And that made the community a lot safer. So those would be a few of the ways I saw it. And then you get out to community events too. There's good too, right? It's not all bad. So I'd get out and try and go to some of the community events. And it's actually really nice when you can have positive interactions. Because like even for me joining policing, I signed up wanting to be a school liaison officer. Like I actually almost became a teacher because I really like working with kids. I like coaching hockey. So it was good to get to go into schools. And I've been a part of a lot of like student police academies or youth academies where you spend a week, instructing kids from 6 a.m. till 10 p.m. And some of them I've maintained relationships with even years later. You still go for lunch or, they're in their mid-20s now and they, in a way, almost like a little bit of a mentor, like you stay in touch and kind of check in with them as they go along. So that, again, really cool to see some of the positive sides of policing too.
What is the philosophy in the departments you've worked for as far as the kind of person that is an SRO, that is in the school? Because I've had some really interesting conversations with people. I just had Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman on again, so we revisited that subject. He's got a great book, Assassination Generation. But, more often than not, you see it as an overtime position or, a kind of retirement position. But then when you think about the 0 to 100 element of someone walking in with an assault rifle, for example, it's the reverse. I would argue you need a very, very competent police officer to be responding to that particular event. So you've got the proactive side as well. So that person can't be RoboCop. They've got to be able to be that mentor too. God for, hoping that there isn't any violence in that school. So what was the kind of person that they were looking to put in the schools in your department?
Pretty varied. It really depended, it is a crucial position. First off, you mentioned Dave Grossman. For anyone listening, go check out that episode once you're done, because his wisdom is just awesome. He's got tons of good stuff to share. But really, it should be some of our best people. I think at times, a lot of people seek the action in policing. So like when I got hired, I went to a chief's interview and they said, "What do you want to do in your career?" And I said, "I want to be a school liaison officer." And the entire management board just burst out laughing, because nobody comes in and says that. People come in and say, "I want to do canine, I want to do ERT, I want to do homicide, I want to do ident." Who's coming in saying, "I want to teach kids in schools"? Like, most of those people went off to be teachers. But maybe that means that's the kind of stuff we need to look for. We need to look for people that want to have that impact in their community, and not just in that reactive way. You mentioned I kind of agree with you. There's two sides. One is like the safety side. You need someone who's tactical enough to be ready to respond. It basically, I say this with no disrespect, it can't be a dumping ground. It can't be, we have this person who's a problem, let's send them over to schools. It doesn't matter. That's the wrong way to look at it. It needs to be, a high accountability, the kind of position where you make it sought after. You find ways to make it a place that people want to go, that maybe in whatever systemic changes you make to do that. Maybe it's part of the promotional system. Maybe you need experience there to get promoted to the next level, or whatever things you can do within the culture to make it positive. But yeah, I've seen personally, my anecdotal experience, I mean, we've had lots of positions for that. I've seen what I would describe as some very high performers. Like, one of my mentors was someone who spent a significant amount of time in schools and was awesome. But I think at times it's also been the place where, this person isn't really doing well. I don't really want them on patrol, so we're going to go put them somewhere that seems, a little easier or whatnot. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, my son had a bad experience with a horrendous SRO in middle school. And between her and the principal, it was a nightmare. And we uncovered that, basically, a long story short, they were sending kids off for a 5150 Baker Act, a psychological hold. So they would send them to a psych facility, take your shoelaces, 72 hours in a cell, because these kids were having emotional issues, not threatening suicide, not threatening to shoot up the school. And it was horrendous. And now the law has changed. And I've said this many times, if those two idiots did the same thing now, they would be behind bars. And yet I believe she's still working in schools, which is just, ridiculous. But when I went to her, the sheriff's department blamed the school system, and the school system blamed the sheriff's department. So obviously there's just a, cancer of cowardice in the leadership there. But imagine now that same turd, someone walks in with a gun. I just know, the kind of person that she is, that there would be a lot of dead kids, because that wasn't the right person, at all. So, it terrifies me, because I've had, in my son's elementary, we had a near miss. They had a code red, and thank God it was a threat, but it never went through, from I think it was a boyfriend of one of the parents, who said he was going to come to the school and shoot it up. And I was in the school. I happened to be dropping my son off to after a medical appointment. And so I got to see how vulnerable they were. So to me, having not only the first responders lens as far as being trained from the outside in, but being a parent on the inside, absolutely you need to have a hard charger in there. Now, like you said, it could be someone right off the bat. It could be someone that spent 15 years in the worst areas in town, and now they've got that experience, but they're looking to be, in a little different environment. But to put the problem cop, the obese cop, the elderly cop that can barely do anything anymore in a school where you're protecting, the ratio is 1 to, 1,000 children, we've seen the results. We've seen, whether it's poor leadership in Uvalde, whether it's cowardice in Parkland, the wrong person results in numerous deaths, and that is unacceptable.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear you had such a bad experience, James. The other thing I would add some more kind of layers to it. Number one is training. right? We have like active shooter training. And in my opinion, I think sometimes it's a little more fixated on like move this way, move that way. And I think instead back to lethal force psychology, like, okay, how much time do you have in training? So let's say up here, you got 26 weeks before a police officer leaves the academy, hits the road. In other places, it's 40 or whatnot. It's different. So much of your time is spent on marksmanship, on shooting, pulling a trigger in a range at a piece of paper. And a very, very, very tiny portion is anything around lethal force psychology in actually preparing for you're human. And when this happens, you're going to have your, oh my God moment. You're going to be scared for your life. And now you got to take a breath and then you got to keep going. And I think we got to actually teach a little bit more about some of that kind of stuff. And I say it because, I mean, I've done 10 years in an ERT program or SWAT program. So I've had some calls that have been a little like, oh, wow, that was kind of close. Like, you know, a few times when you're like, today, this is real. Excuse me. And I think we need to do a much better job of training cops for that tactical aspect. I think, you know, if you can watch YouTube videos, you can find all kinds of examples of horrendously handled calls, horrendous tactics. And I think it's because we're not yet doing a good enough job preparing ourselves within the culture. So that's one side, is the tactical side. The other side is almost like that education understanding piece, because, you know, I can tell from speaking with you, from reading your stuff, like how much you know about trauma and suicide and all these kind of topics. Like, you have a very advanced understanding that your average person does not, and your average police officer does not, right? I mean, I see it from talking to people. I've even had doctors where you talk to them and they don't know that much about it. I've been shocked at how little at times some people know, even those in, you know, professions and in those that are adjacent to this kind of topic, including law enforcement. What do cops really get taught about suicide? I would argue almost nothing. We literally just get taught, yeah, suicidal person, take them to the thing. And then if you don't, you're at risk. Then if they go and die, then, you know, you're going to get fired and sued and whatnot. And I'll say, I've been on that other side of it. I've talked to someone who had made some sort of suicidal comments. And then they say, no, I'm not suicidal. I said it, yes, but I didn't mean it. I was just trying to get something from my parents or whatever. Well, that person actually did go jump off a bridge after. Right. And I remember coming back into work going, oh my God, like, am I getting fired? Am I getting sued? Am I getting charged? Like, no, we made the best decision we could with a very challenging situation. So I think that's where, like, we need to teach cops about those topics. And there is so much good information, but it's like turning the Titanic. It's such a slow evolution of police culture and subcultures to actually educate them. And I think there are many of us who haven't learned this. And I've learned a lot of it because I've gone and done the research on my own, out of my own interest, my own mental health, and I've seen all my peers. It's then helped me when I've interacted with people who are suicidal or in those kind of traumatized situations. But just from speaking to peers, there's lots of officers who don't know very much about it, and they're trying their best without really having the sufficient knowledge and resources to do it, you know, at a level that I think you and I would want them to do it.
It's interesting hearing you say that story, because I mean that's so tragic, but it reminds me of the way that a lot of us in the paramedic side are told by medical directors, we'll just take everyone to hospital because of liability. And what ends up happening is, you know, ERs are completely overwhelmed, and a lot of people just don't need to be there. But you've got organizations that are too scared not to take them because of the what if. Now, I'm not talking about chest pain and stroke. Obviously, those have to go to a hospital, you know, partial decapitation. But, you know, the tummy ache or whatever it is, if all the vitals have come through and, you know, the patient doesn't want to go, whatever it is, there are a lot of people that go to hospital. Some of them don't even really want to go. They've been talked into going, and it's because of litigation. And so as professions, if you've done the right thing as a paramedic, as a police officer, that should be enough. But what you see is people will take that one case. Oh, this person, you know, the paramedics left and then their head exploded, and that's why we have to take everyone. And it's like, no, it's not. Just like you can't save everyone when it comes to addiction or suicide. And I use this example with, you know, with government support. We always talk about, you know, that person who abused food stamps or government housing or whatever it is. When do you ever hear a story of all the good that those programs do, of the mother or father or whatever that got back on their feet and have now, you know, working and they've bought themselves a home, and you don't hear those stories. And so, of course, if the officer leaves them on the side of the bridge and they jump, that's a different story altogether. But if the officer was diligent and they listened to them and they said, look, I was just upset, which is exactly what, my son didn't even make any comments like that, but he was just upset. The protocols that should have been followed is they should have called the mental health place, they would have evaluated. De-escalation was the absolute priority in this whole process, because you're talking about elementary school kids. And then, but they also kept the parents away. They did not contact me through this whole thing. I only found out because I was calling the school. So my child was basically kidnapped. So, but you're doing that because after Parkland, there was this kind of knee jerk. And literally, when my son was in this facility, numerous other elementary school kids from this one school kept cycling through. So that means that there was a revolving door constantly. And when I pulled the police records, I mean, like over 100 children in 1 year had been Baker-Act. Now, I can count on one hand how many people were Baker-Act in my 14-year career as a firefighter working in the shittiest parts of town. And you're telling me, over 100 children from that elementary school were deemed an absolute threat to themselves or someone else. So it goes back again to what we were talking about. You can't take one example and then blanket a policy because of a one what if, because sometimes things happen even though everyone did everything right. And we've got to have the courage to say and stand by your men and women and say, look, they followed everything that we taught them to do. And the rules and regs were in place that were, they were good protocols. Sometimes things happen that are, so far out of left field that you cannot be ready for it. And you can't then make everyone terrified, paralysis by analysis, to make a good decision because of this anomaly what if situation.
Yeah. I think even when we look at it from a risk perspective, when we are attempting risk avoidance to just fully do everything we can so there's no risk, often that comes with its own problems. And to me, I think what you're describing, what little bit I know from the discussion, that sounds to me likely the kind of situation. And I see it a bit in like our emergency response work where we go, there's risk. There's risk whether you use some of these tactics, whether you take action, and there's risk of inaction. There's risk of doing nothing. So what we're meant to be doing is like doing everything we can to mitigate risk, to give ourselves the best odds for a positive outcome, but we may not have full control. And the answer may not be, it's almost like, Jocko Willink and the dichotomy of leadership. When you go too far to one end, you're usually going to have a problem. And I think that's a little bit of what you've described. And the other big one is to me, is partly training, knowledge, and education. Like we throw cops into these situations. They're supposed to be the expert at everything, expert tactically, expert, on de-escalation, expert on communication and all these things. And I don't think we're yet investing the resources that they are. And I wish they were. I wish we had more resources and better training. Like, awesome, we need it. Let's do it. But I think so often, just due to costs and budgets and whatnot, we really don't yet have that. And I would love to see us do more.
I think what I saw in this particular situation was a lack of humility, because there was this resource that all they had to do was pick up the phone. It was the end of the school day, and I saw 2 jobs worth just wanting to go home. Ultimately is what came out of this. But having the humility to say, and this obviously comes from leadership, like, hey, you are not psychological evaluators, teacher and cop. So use these resources, be there, obviously mitigate anything that's within your scope of practice. If it's outside that, then, ask for help. Go to the people that we are provided with these protocols and ask the real experts to come and evaluate or, interact or counsel or whatever needs to happen. But I think that's where that arrogance comes. If you're from an arrogant agency, which I see locally here, then that's going to then be pervasive all the way down. And you're not going to, get people to be humble enough to say, look, I don't know what to do in this. This is outside my capabilities. Let me be humble enough to say we need to use the resource that we've been told about. But if you have that arrogance, then you're like, we'll just send them to this place. And then you're ultimately doing so much damage, because I can tell you in this school particularly, I'm sorry, it wasn't, it was a middle school. I've been saying the elementary school, this is middle school. I apologize. Do you think any of those kids were reaching out when they were struggling after hearing what happened when you reach out? Not a fucking single one. So you have now destroyed any mental health, cause for help now, because just like we talk about in law enforcement, someone says they need help and now they take their badge and their gun. Same thing with these children. You just destroyed all trust. And who knows now the ripple effect of all those incarcerations, wrongful incarcerations, as these children progress, into adulthood. Because I know my son was traumatized because he, like I said, there's no other way to describe it. He was kidnapped. He was already seeing counseling. He was going through some stuff emotionally. We were divorced. There was a tension in his mother's household. So yeah, he was upset, but he wasn't threatening himself, wasn't threatening anyone else. He was just upset. And now, even to this day, trying to get him to even consider going to counselor now is hard because they completely destroyed that. So like you said, the damage of doing the wrong thing more often than not far outweighs having the courage to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe add a little more context for you, James. I would say, looking back in my career, the number of people I've dealt with that were in emotional distress, suicidal, all that kind of thing is extremely high, like way beyond what I can count it, well into the hundreds. And I will say some of those I could have done better. Some of those I made mistakes early in my career. When I think back to how I handled something at a 1 or 2 year cop, and I actually have one in particular I can think of where I had to use some force to apprehend someone. So that's what we call it up here, a mental health apprehension, person suicidal, that kind of thing. And in my mind at the time, I was concerned they would kill themselves if I did not use force at that point. And they were basically trying to like lock me out of the door when I was trying to get them, because the information I had was they were suicidal. I think knowing what I know now, I would have been slower. I would have been softer. Like, I don't think I did anything illegal nor wrong. I didn't think I breached policy. But with a greater understanding of the holistic aspect of it, like, I think I made a mistake. I think I could have done that a lot better, and I share that because you're probably not the only person who's had a bad experience with someone from law enforcement. And I think, we need to be honest and take a look at the big picture of what we can do better. And the answer isn't always we did it perfect. And I think that does come back to training and to education, where those of us who've been there and done that and who've had more experience now help teach the newer people better ways of doing it. And I think we have evolved more de-escalation and there's improvement, but there is probably still a long way to go on what we can continue to improve. So I share that just to try and take ownership of some of the mistakes I've made in my career and to apologize to you. Like, I'm sorry, that sounds very hard. I have 2 sons. It would be very hard for me to experience something like that as well. I mean, my sons are much younger right now, but I can, I'm sorry to hear you went through that. I just wanted to share that little, like, take ownership of what things I could improve in my own experiences and, apologize to you for what you went through.
Yeah. Well, no apologies needed, but I think by talking about this, it's not blame as much as just, all right, let's grow. Let's learn from these mistakes, because they were mistakes. And like I said, this law's changed now, and I don't know what's happening in that agency anymore. Thank God my son just graduated from the school system. And again, outside of that, great school system. And he's had an amazing group of teachers that have led him through. But those particular people, that's, those bad apples can ruin so much. But if it's learned from, if it's changed, if there's evolution, then it's worth talking about. It's like COVID. You can't just sweep it under the carpet like, oh, let's not talk about all the pre-existing conditions that are still killing people. No, you have to reflect back on COVID and go, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? So that when the next virus comes, we've got a more resilient population. I want to go back to your career path, though, because obviously 2016, 2017 was 2015 was a kind of the beginning of a struggle for you. So walk me through any, what we call career calls that you had prior to that, anything that started kind of questioning your morality a little bit. And then what was that downward spiral for you specifically?
Yeah, sure. I think mine was more ongoing continuation of chronic aspects as opposed to a singular, some people have a massive trauma that just they go from 0 to 100 kind of thing. Mine started within a couple months. It's the one I referred to of the first fatal next of kin notification I did. And I think it was partly that I went to the scene and I did the next of kin. So you have the on-scene trauma for several hours. quite graphic scene. And I won't share the details just due to vicarious trauma and whatnot. But then it's, going to the house and then seeing the emotional pain of the family, and I'll share that little piece. But after telling them their daughter had died, the mother falls to her knees, not just crashes to her knees and starts praying for the other driver to survive, and doesn't even know if the other driver is at fault, drunk, anything. You just found out you just lost your daughter, and you're just praying to God that other person lives. It really crushed me. That really broke. I carried a lot of pain from that for like 10 years. And it wasn't time that healed it. It was eventually starting to work on it. So I had a lot of those kind of things that adding up, even working in a community I grew up in, I would go to, for example, a suicide of someone I knew, grew up with, and I would keep the call. And like they were found by their daughter. And again, very unfair, very tragic situation. And with what I know now, I wouldn't keep the call. I would have said, hey, someone who doesn't know this person should take this. I didn't do that. That was my mistake. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And then I had two people, well, at that time, two people tried to make me kill them. 2 suicide by cop attempts. I didn't actually shoot either of them, but those both really rocked my world. So if I had to pick a couple of my big rocks in my backpack, those ones really hit me hard. And I just suffered from all these nightmares. That was my big thing. And then I suffered from what I would probably describe as alcoholism, trying to cope with the nightmares. And then every night I relived needing to shoot and kill people. And I so badly didn't want to. And what I learned from a book like The Body Keeps the Score, I wasn't remembering, I was reliving, because your body is going through the same, you get into brain science of you're actually re-experiencing those same feelings as though it's some of the worst moments of your life over and over again every night, which then led to the drinking to try and kind of cope with it. And then I also would say I had some kind of moral injuries. Like I felt like I was kind of being screwed, lied to, deceived, let down by those that are supposed to support you. I didn't know what a moral injury was. I just knew I had a lot of anger about it, right? Of like, what do you mean you're lying to me? You're lying to me about the lies. Like, and then 6 months later, you're lying, saying I never said that. And what I learned, you really should get things in writing so that people can't do that. And I also learned how that's such a leadership failure. When we're afraid of conflict and we can't just say the truth, even if this person doesn't like it, we lie to them. Well, eventually they're probably going to find out, and it's going to get even harder. And that's a little bit of where I got to. And I still kept trying to work, and everyone around me is telling me they're worried about me, and people come and ask me if I'm suicidal. And, but I so badly was just the stigma. I was worried that people would never trust me. I was told basically I'd have PTSD. If anyone ever knew that, you'd never be deployed again. You couldn't work frontline. You couldn't work ERT work. So tried to hide as best I could. And then eventually just asked for help. That was really hard. I went to our chief and I told him. I went to the head of our emergency response team, and same thing. And fortunately, I had 2 fantastic leaders, and not just those 2. I had other ones in my chain of command, great leaders who did a great job of helping me, and a team that really supported me. And that was a part of what helped me as I healed.
Before we go into your kind of healing journey, it's really interesting unpacking the psychology of death by cop. One person told me that if someone is a devout Christian, for example, and suicide is perceived as a sin, it's almost viewed as a biblical loophole if you get a cop to shoot you instead. You've obviously taken a deep dive into this world. What are some of the other contributing factors of these people choosing a cop to do it rather than other means?
We have such a powerful resistance to causing our own death. So for anyone who wants to know more about suicide, there's a guy named Dr. Thomas Joyner. I write a little bit about his insights in my chapter on suicide. He's got 2 books I'd highly recommend: Myths About Suicide and Why People Die from Suicide. Now, he's one of the top researchers I can find. He lost his father to a suicide, which is where his passion comes from. So what he describes is basically you're going to have 2 categories. People are not necessarily in the same category, but they might be in both. One is your desire for death. So that basically can come from the massive emotional pain, psychological pain. I've seen you post things about feeling like a burden to others. So that's one of his big underlying factors, perceived burdensomeness. His other one is like thwarted belonging. which would be kind of like isolation, often things like the breakup, relationship breakdown, right? That'd be one of the primary or a top risk factor. So you have that desire for death, perceived desire for death, which what you don't actually know is your brain's tricking you into thinking it wants to die. And I would describe this as just my own Mark hat on. I have a chapter on like the subconscious mind, right? Intuition, essentially. But when we're overwhelmed with pain, I think our subconscious is looking for an out to that pain. And that starts to kind of become seductive, where you have a constriction of thought. So you start thinking, okay, remove the suffering, remove the situation I can't change. And often when you can't, then this becomes this greater and greater perception of our only answer. But what we have is such an overwhelming resistance to killing ourselves that's ingrained in us. So even if you have all this pain and you feel this desire to die, you often are not able to enact lethal self-injury. And that's where people will do things in an attempt to have someone else cause their death. So I actually use the analogy in my book of a car crash. I've seen it where people die from a car crash by driving into oncoming traffic, stepping in front of traffic, things like that. And one day, it was only a couple of years ago, I interviewed a commercial truck driver, and he had survived one of those fatal head-on crashes. Someone had died in a suicide, left a suicide note, and tried driving into oncoming traffic. Spoke to the driver in the vehicle ahead of the truck. They actually managed to dodge that assailant who was coming in their lane. And obviously a giant semi-truck was not able to get out of the way. Thankfully, that driver survived. But just from speaking to them, like obviously was deeply traumatized from the experience. Like, it was massive fire everywhere. It was an absolutely crazy scene. And I think that's a comparable for suicide by cop. You have someone who feels all this pain, who's intending to die, but as they think about it and it becomes seductive to them in a way, they're not able to do it. They're not able to overcome that powerful resistance. And then they seek other ways of doing it where I can provoke someone. So in my first suicide by cop attempt, someone pointed an imitation firearm at me and they provoked a police response. They purposely had us come. He waited for 30 minutes laying in a bed, just sitting there with a gun next to him, just not answering, not moving, nothing. And then sat up and pointed the gun directly at me. And I got out of the way. My brain screamed, shoot or move. And I moved. I wasn't ready for this, back to this whole lethal force psychology. And I couldn't believe I didn't hear gunshots. We had 8 cops all around this guy. No one shot him. And someone, my cover, or less lethal taser operator, went on the radio and said, he just pointed a gun at us. And then I went, this guy's pointing a gun at the police. I have to shoot him. So I came back up with my gun and he now dropped it. Like, we're talking within a few seconds. I couldn't understand what's going on here. And I can now explain it so much better, because what will often happen is your self-preservation instinct will kick in right after you try and die. And I cite Kevin Hines. He jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge trying to die. And he's now a big suicide prevention advocate. I'm guessing you know who he is. I could see you kind of nodding there. And he talks about want to die. His hands are on the railing. And as soon as he lets go of the railing, all he wants to do is live. And I think that's a similar experience to what many people would experience with thoughts of suicide. They think they want to die. And then as soon as they start to enact that death or start to overcome that resistance, then they realize, there's another girl I cite in my book named Emma Benoit, and she shot herself. And after thinking she wants to die, she shoots herself and right away, oh my God, what have I done? What have I done? She doesn't want to die. And so it's actually the same for my follow-up suicide by cop attempts. The second one, the guy actually had a gun in his waistband, again, an imitation gun, came out, prompts a police response, comes in as more of like a hostage call, but eventually comes out and it's just me there, kind of a long story. I won't get into too much details, but lifts up his shirt. I can see the gun. He's reaching for it. I take my gun off safe and he just takes the gun and throws it on the ground. And same thing. He didn't point at me that time, but I couldn't wrap my head around, you're trying to die, but then you have this overwhelming urge to live after. Right. So I that's where I've read some of these things have helped me so much to understand it. What's your, you have a lot of deep knowledge from speaking to a lot of people on this topic. What do you think, James?
Well, it's funny because I quote Kevin and Emma all the time. They've both been on the show separately. And that is exactly, their responses that you've worded, because I think they've only had those two. And then I think there maybe is someone else I'm forgetting that actually went through with their suicide attempt and survived. So, your eyewitness accounts obviously are few and far between. But that really underlines what I talk about all the time. And this is a statement of compassion and empathy, not judgment. The people that are in crisis, their brain is miswired through this perfect storm, and you hit some of them. Everything from unaddressed childhood trauma to the trauma that we see in our professions, to relationship issues, financial issues, the sleep deprivation from a shift, sleep deprivation from alcohol. All these things, the perfect storm. The brain's reality becomes distorted. And of course, the most obvious one is if people that are suffering, they want the pain to end. But the one that I hear over and over again is, if I just remove myself, I will take away the pain from my family, which makes no sense to a healthy brain. And so what is so sad is when you hear Kevin or Emma talking about the moment after, that's when that self-preservation element finally comes through again. And I'm speaking to Elizabeth Pohl, who's a police officer that started doing forensics on, or autopsies, like informational autopsies on police suicides. Every single suicide that she had, alcohol had been consumed within 12 hours. So you've got this distorted brain. Then you take this drug that we know distorts reality, because, as I say tongue in cheek, many of us listening have probably been with someone of the same or opposite sex, whatever you're into, on alcohol, and then had that kind of next morning moment where you're like, so your judgment was distorted. So it's so powerful to hear, what you've said, what Kevin talks about, what Emma talks about, because it underlines that people do want to live. But that devil in their voice has been given so much power by that miswiring, and then amplified by alcohol in many, many cases, that it wins. And how many people, right when that hammer fell, or they left the bridge, or they stepped out in front of that car, immediately shot back to, I don't want to do this. And so to hear this, in your two stories, traumatic as it was, but what a beautiful story on both events. Even though it left you with moral injury, there's two people that were given a second chance that, if you'd made a different decision, wouldn't have been.
Yeah. Well, there's a third story I share in my book, and it's Dakota Meyer, who's like a Medal of Honor winner from the military. And he tells a story of putting a gun to his head and pulling the trigger. And now firearms is such a lethal means of suicide. And I think it's one of the issues around police suicide is our access to firearms is one of the challenges that we face. Dakota Meyer's still alive many years later. All he would have had to do, he had a loaded magazine. He just didn't have a round in the chamber. And someone with lots of firearms expertise and with what we know of firearms, that is within a couple seconds, you rack around. And if you want to die from suicide, you're dead. Well, he didn't, because I think that to me is that it shows that what so often happens, people don't know until that exact moment when they think they've now caused their death, and then they realize it. And tragically, what I suspect happens for all these people dying from suicide is they experience that same thing. They attempt to die from a suicide, then they realize they don't want to die. And sadly, so many of them do die, which again is part of where my passion comes around this topic. Again, having lost a loved one to suicide. One of the things I've seen Kevin talk about, when he asked, I saw him be asked, what would you tell someone? What would you say to someone? He talked about just breathe. And he talked about long, slow exhales. And really what I think he's trying to do is teach you to regulate your physiology, teach you to help bring yourself right back, right from that edge moment, to activate your prefrontal cortex, to slow down your breathing, which will impact your physiology. And again, I'm not saying the answer is that of just like waiting to the crisis moment. I really do hope it's earlier education. I'd also like to come back to that Dr. Thomas Joyner and his model. And I think it really connects with your audience. Now, I'm sure lots of your audience are first responder and fire. Because one of the things he talks about is that desire for death, desire for suicide, perceived desire for suicide. But he's also talking about acquired ability for lethal self-injury. And he basically is explaining why those of us with military, first responder, fire, police are at higher risk. And it's because we have learned how to push past. We've learned how to push past danger, hardship, pain, fear. That, he basically says we have this courage to go do hard things, to risk ourselves physically, to experience pain. And we have often an exposure to death. And that's a part of essentially, it's like building up what becomes an acquired ability for lethal self-injury. And I can say there's a study of police officers. It was a 4.4 million decedents from Dr. John Violanti, and it found police officers had a 54% higher rate of suicide. I don't know the numbers specifically for fire. I'm guessing you probably know lots because you know so much about this topic, James. But I think we need to start teaching these kind of things at the academy level. And if I can draw in one more person, which is John Violanti, I just referenced him. He's got a book called Police Suicide Epidemic in Blue. And one of the things he says in there is we need to start teaching this at a recruit cadet level. Before you're impacted by the culture, before you show up to the firehouse or the police station and you're impacted by the cynicism and the stigma and some of the things that are there in that culture, we need to start teaching people about these problems ahead of time. And then we also need to wrap it around in a culture that is informed and proactive and supportive about it, because we actually can make cultural changes to make it, more signs that it's okay to get help, to process pain early, to not just wait for the last minute crisis line. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have something for like the last minute type situations, but just to invest so much more in the downstream, like even to bring it all back to what we talked about, like homelessness and drug addiction. It's pay me now or pay me later. And unfortunately, for so long, we haven't invested in those things. And we've seen this ongoing problem where we go, I don't know why it keeps happening. Well, until we start changing things within our culture, within our training, we need to. Let's just leave it that way. What are your thoughts, James?
Well, it's interesting because first, going back to what you said about courage, this is again, I think, why we see a higher, such a high level of suicide. And I know some people say, "Oh, it's the same as the average person." I disagree. I think that the problem is you're looking at the wrong statistics, and I've talked about this a lot recently. The official statistics in our profession woefully underreport how many of us actually are lost to overdose and suicide. I did a slide on the presentation I did the other day on the 24/72 work week, and supposedly we lost 74 firefighters in 2024. Well, I can think of 74 people we lost in the state of Florida. Now we're talking about that were wearing the uniform. That's not even bringing in the massively underreported group, which is the retirees. So I truly believe that, we absolutely have a much higher, and for the reasons that you're talking about. Firstly, for your profession, you have the means of suicide strapped to your hip, which certainly doesn't help. But as I've said, firstly, this is a group of people that said, if needed, I will die trying to rescue someone, a complete stranger in my community. So now you go back to that distorted mind. I've said this many, many times on here, but I think it needs to be said. When we were young, people said suicide was cowardly and selfish, and how could you think of your kids? Well, now take that same person who's courageous, who's basically prepared to die for strangers, and now you've distorted their mind to where they truly believe that their kids are scared of them, that they'd be better off without them, that they're the reason for their wife's pain or their husband's pain or whoever it is, and if they just remove themselves, everyone will be happier. That's where the courage comes in. It's tragic because it's distorted. But if you think about it at that moment, my opinion is that at that moment they were terrified, and it was a courageous and selfless act through a distorted mind. Now, the reality, of course, is it passes the pain on to everyone that's left, and now they have trauma too. But when we understand it and we stop casting this guilt and shame that they were a coward, they were selfish, and we actually listen to the experts and the lived experience of survivors, you realize that that is the case. And when you have a courageous group of men and women that put on a uniform, then of course you've got all the ingredients, God forbid, if their mind starts lying to them, for their own self-harm as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard so many examples from you have so much anecdotal wisdom from just speaking to people and then seeing those patterns. And I can find when I speak with you about this, I often recognize what you share from that lines up with some of the things I've read from different experts and academics and books. But I want to draw an example of what you're saying, like that element of perceived burdensomeness and why someone thinks they're doing good, even though they're not. It's a perceived burdensomeness. It's not true. You're not truly a burden. Your family's truly not better. I totally want to acknowledge that. But I have someone I know, a coworker, and he went on a podcast, heard him speak about it. And he talked about his son saying to him, "Why do you hate me?" Now think about that for a minute. Mm-hmm. So what you have is someone who loves their family, who goes to work as a police officer to keep people safe, and then is traumatized through work. injury, loss of identity, lots of things went wrong in that person's world. And then what happens? Now you go home and you're yelling at your kids, and maybe you're drinking too much, right? There's all the things that are now piling on, that now you're that little voice in your head saying, see, they're better off without you. And I don't think it's often a one-off thing. I think it's this accumulation as you go further and further down that road, and you have no answer. And if the pain feels so unbearable and your brain is so badly seeking an out, because I think for those of us that aren't there and that have never been in any kind of suicidal ideation, it's hard to wrap our heads around how someone could perceive that, how someone could actually think, what do you mean you think your family's better off without you? Right? It's like, it's because of moments like that. I talked to someone else who was a police officer, and they had a moment like that where I can't remember what was said exactly, but a quote kind of like that from one of their kids of like, why does dad hate me? And they quit policing. That was their answer. It was like, I can't tolerate that my kid thinks that, so I'm going to leave and I'm going to go do something else. And that's certainly a much better option than suicide. Like, we got to normalize other decisions, but we also got to create that cultural impact where, what can we do to make it safe to talk about? And what do we do with someone who's experienced this? And I'll say, like, I have had suicidal ideation, so I didn't even recognize that as suicidal thoughts. But like for me, mine was like always envisioning driving into oncoming traffic over a certain period of my life when I went through my hardest time. That was so common for me. And it was actually later. It wasn't the part I write about in my book. Certainly earlier on is when I was off work on stress leave. I kept working throughout this whole period. I had a young son. I was married, but I never told a soul. I wrote a chapter about suicide, yet I experienced that afterward. And I still never said a word, never asked for help about it, never did anything. So this idea that, well, if only people would ask for help and access the resources that are there, I think we're looking at the problem wrong or incorrectly. And we need to instead look at the culture. How do we make it safe to be human? How do we build connection? How do we build in healthy habits so that the earlier intervention and less people reaching that point of, severe suicidal ideation?
You just reminded me when we were talking about oncoming traffic. The other person I had who survived their own attempt was Angela Lee, MMA fighter. I think she was one champion, one FC champion. And then she ends up losing her younger sister to suicide. And Angela has become this huge voice now in the mixed martial arts world when it comes to mental health, especially, women's mental health, because it's a quieter voice. But I think going back to what you were saying as far as being proactive, and you talk about this in your book, all these different pillars that are contributing to it. The reason why I harp on the work week, the progressive work week and full staffing in first responder professions is the impact of sleep deprivation. That is an actionable element that we know contributes to all things mental ill health that we can address. Another one, as you alluded to, at the front door, education on all these elements, but also understanding that if you put on a uniform, there's a good chance that you had some challenges when you were younger. And so if addressed, that becomes resilience. That becomes a strength in uniform, hands down. And I love the hope of post-traumatic growth rather than the doom and gloom of a PTSD diagnosis. We need to talk about, you wouldn't break your leg and just walk around, giving talks on how your femur's sticking out your leg. You get your fucking leg fixed, it's no different. So, but understanding at the front door that these young people were driven to serve for a reason, and be proud of that. Be like, look, you are going to have some shit going on. It is okay, because that is what made you, step up, toe the line when everyone else is like, nah, I'm good. I'll just go and, do the other thing in my community. So be proud of that, but let's be aware of it and let's start working through it. So I've been a big proponent of why not do counseling from day one? You do PT, why not have X amount of counseling sessions in your rookie year? And then, the tune-ups there on in. Because you've normalized that conversation at the front door. You've created a strong relationship with the mental health counselor. And either someone had a Disney-like childhood and they end up just having great conversations with the counselor, or more likely, someone's going to start unpacking some things that needed to be unpacked. And that's going to serve them well and reinforce that foundation rather than further damage it.
Yeah. So I would describe, what you're saying is like a systemic level, improvement. And my old agency actually was very progressive. And the previous chief, the chief while I was there, his name's Neil DeBoard. He actually wrote one of the recommendations on the back of my book. But I really look up to him as a leader and how he does things. So what they did is they made it normal. So when you're an applicant to Delta, they have a form and they say, okay, who's your dentist, who's your doctor, and who's your psychologist? And then they also say, okay, we'd like to know how much we need to prepare for. Please tell us the frequency of use of which you're going to use these things we're going to be paying for. And what they're trying to do is just normalize it. You basically make it okay in our culture to say, not only is it okay, it's expected. And what I say, what you'd also want to do as your leaders, from your senior leaders, is you tell your frontline leaders, I am asking you to make an appointment with a psychologist once a month. And I'm asking you to say it at briefing that, okay, what you're trying to do is make it okay for all of your team to do it. I don't care if you actually need help. I don't care if you talk about the football game and the hockey game or whatever you want to do. What I'm actually asking you to do within the culture is give all your people permission to do this. And I would say from my own, I did a master's degree in leadership and I studied police culture and police officer mental health. And that was what I heard doing my interviews is people talking about the stigma. Over half my participants said they wanted to be ordered to go and see a psychologist on a recurring basis. And yet many of those same people described many years of symptoms of trauma. Like I can't diagnose them, but very extreme symptoms of trauma. And yet they've never done it once. So they're saying, order me to go. Cops don't want to be told to do anything. And yet they're literally saying, please order me to go. To translate what they're really saying, make it safe for me to go. Even though I can already go for free and no one needs to know, I don't feel safe doing it. I'm worried that I'm going to be perceived as crazy and a problem and someone's going to find out. And so what they're asking us to do is to destigmatize it. And that's a big challenge. How do you measure that? That's not a simple thing to do. But back to what you can do, that intake form, that what your expectations are from your leaders, make it so they can do it on duty. Can you go to physio on duty? Can you go to the doctor on duty? Again, I don't know about you guys for fire, but like as a police officer, depending where you work, that might be possible. Well, can you go to a psychologist on duty? Could you do a Zoom call or whatever? Like I would argue that you should be able to, and that back to the staffing levels. If we normalize those kind of things, we'll have less people off work and unable to work, and we will have less of a long-term problem because we're back to investing in those problems in the short term.
100%. Well, I want to go back to, you mentioned obviously that you had your own PTSD diagnosis at one point. When you reflect back now, where were some of the darkest places that you got to? And then talk to me about discovering your own toolbox. What were the accumulation of elements that you started using that worked for you specifically?
Sure. So my biggest factors, one was the nightmares. Like I didn't understand them and I knew they were coming every night and they were just so hard for me because I was re-experiencing the same feelings of some of the worst times of my life. A second one was rage. I remember one day someone didn't put a turn signal on and I screamed at them for like 30 seconds at the top of my lungs to the point like my throat couldn't stop hurting. And it wasn't about that turn signal, but you don't see it in the moment. And then I ultimately had what I describe as panic attacks. I still don't know if that's what they were. I can tell you what happened. I went out to a restaurant. It's like a busy Denny's on a Saturday in crowded Vancouver restaurant. And we're just having regular conversation. I couldn't even tell you what about. And I just couldn't stop crying. Like I couldn't even speak. I couldn't catch my breath. I was trying to say things like what's happening and what's wrong with me. And I can't even say what. And eventually I have to just run out of the restaurant. I ran out to my car. Had no idea what to do. I just started working on my breathing because like you're not doing well. I had one of those again the following day. And I'd been working on our emergency response team that whole week before and that whole next week. I wasn't really ready for the next crazy call. Not at all. But I was too, unwilling to ask for the help that I needed. So, sorry, that was the kind of symptoms. And what was the next part you asked for? Kind of what helped me? Is that what you're looking for?
Exactly. I think this is one of the things that's so powerful too, is that everyone's toolbox is different. Some people talk therapy and psych meds might be the perfect match. More often than not, there are other things that are needed. So what were the tools that started working for you specifically?
Oh, wow. The number one thing I realized for me, and it's very universal, was to take action. Like just doing anything, doing something. So the biggest thing for that was journaling. I had someone I look at as a mentor and a peer and a friend who recommended it to help them. and I tried it. So I have about 40 pages of journaling about my time on stress leave. And I share that in my book. I share large portions of it, just trying to destigmatize it. That's what I learned we can do since then. I also sought professional help. I went and saw a psychologist. I remember I had gone a few years before, and I thought of it like surgery. I went one time, took me 3 hours to drive there, drive home, and I went, I'm never doing that again. Nothing seems better. I didn't realize it's more like physio. It's the thing you go do, and then you got to go work on it. It's not a surgery where you just show up and you're all fixed. It's now, here's how someone helping you navigate your way through it. And then it's on you to go practice things. You got, say 1 hour a week or 1 hour a month, and you got the rest of your month or week to work on things. So for me, what did some of those look like? Like things like trying to control my physiology, trying to control my breathing. Honestly, one of the biggest ones was stop drinking. I had no idea how bad alcohol was for me, nor that I was coping through it. Like I'd become an alcoholic. I just didn't know it. And I've seen that in so many of my buddies. And usually they're having a hard time and they tell you about it and you ask, and where's your drinking at? And it's not in a good place because that's how they're coping. And so often we can't hear you got a drinking problem. But like I did, I woke up one day, it's like 9 a.m. and I went, I need to quit drinking. And my next thought was, I can't. And then I'm like, okay, well, can you go an hour? And so that's what I did. I'm going to go 1 hour. And that 1 hour turned into one day that I said, like I literally wrote on my whiteboard on my fridge, I won't drink today. That turned into, I didn't drink yesterday. I won't drink today. That turned into a week because a month was too long, right? And a day was too long at first. And so I would encourage anyone, if you're struggling or someone who's struggling, start thinking of micro goals. It's what you do when things get really hard. If you want to go on, Navy SEAL tryouts or SWAT tryouts, all that kind of stuff, it's going to get super hard. You don't need to worry about the rest of the week. You just need to worry about running to that next post. You need to worry about doing the push-up you're working on right now, not all those other things that's just too overwhelming. So eventually that not drinking for a week turned into not drinking for a month. And now I've got back to the point where I can have a social drink and it's fine. But I don't drink like I used to. I'm not having like, I hit a point where I think I had 26 ounces of rum in a week. And I'm basically a non-drinker. So that was a lot of alcohol. Whereas now I might go a month and not have a drink. But like, I don't know, maybe a week ago, my wife said, hey, let's have a drink. Sure. Sounds great. Hey, let's celebrate. Let's do this. Awesome. I'm in, but it's not a big part of my life anymore. And the reason is because my life got so much better. And that actually is what led to me. I yelled out in my kitchen one day. I was all alone, off work on stress leave. And as I've been learning and getting better, I actually yelled out, why the fuck don't they teach us this? And I was so angry that I'd suffered for 10 years. And I didn't need to. And then that's where my mission came from. And just seeing all my buddies around me and how many had suffered in their own ways. And I actually met with our head of training one day, someone in charge of training about 1,000 cops a year. And and the 4 psychologists. And I told them the chapter topics of my book, essentially. I said, we need to teach all these things: stigma, emotional pain, suicide, organizational stress, moral injury, sleep science. And they listened, but they weren't going to change. You're turning the Titanic. We can't change. So again, they were nice. There's no disparagement of them. And I just said, I can't make you teach this, but you can't stop me. And I said it in my head. I didn't tell them. Again, I'm not trying to put them down. But I just decided I'm going to do what I can to start helping with this. Like I can't accept the current reality, so I'm going to do something. And I read there's an Ontario coroner's inquest into police suicide. It's from 9 suicides in 2018. They did the inquest in 2019. And that was one of the top recommendations was we need to reduce stigma, normalize mental health. And what I realized, the very first thing in my journaling is like, no one can ever know, don't tell anyone, because it was an email to my brother, right? A brother, not my real brother, but a brother on the team. And then I realized I had to do the opposite. The best way I could help people is to actually share, put that out to the world and normalize that. And since then, I've heard from so many people about how it's helped, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a first responder, and even just civilians. And because there is so much good information. And what I would love to see one day is not just that we teach it to first responders. This is the kind of stuff we need to teach in school. We need to teach about suicide and emotional pain and trauma. You want to make sure we don't have drug addicts? Then teach people to help themselves. So that, again, I appreciate what you're doing, James, with your books and your podcast, because you're an awesome advocate in the fire profession, especially. And my hope is to do something similar in our profession, like what you do about the sleep schedule for firefighters. Well, I just came off 2 days, 2 nights, like why are we still doing this? There's no worse schedule that we could find. What are we doing? And just trying to advocate, well, let's try something different. Let's be willing to risk failure, and let's try and make some positive change within our culture too.
It's amazing how many phrases I hear now that really are just born out of cowardice. And I say that absolutely deliberately. That'll never happen. They'll never go for it. Oh, but it's complicated. You know, it'll take time, all this shit. And I'm like, you know what? Bollocks. When the planes hit the towers, how many people turned on a fucking dime and said, I'm going to go sign up? The military, police, fire, whatever. One single event changed the entire landscape of people in uniform. When COVID hit, how quickly was it to shut down the entire planet? But you're telling me that putting in some proactive mental health, tools, or restructuring a work week and taking the money that you're wasting in lack of retention and overtime and putting it proactively and hiring young recruits, oh, that'll take time. No, it fucking won't take time. This is what pisses me off. The departments that have made it happen, they just went into a room and they said, hey, this isn't working. Kind of like we were talking about with drug prohibition. And in Portugal, let's try something different. And all the grown-ups in the room go, yeah, that actually makes sense. Let's just do it. And then they fucking do it. So this is what is so maddening is, you and I probably have been aware of this more, as you said, than some people, because we have a kind of echo chamber because we just dove headfirst into all these great minds that have already been out there in the mental health space. But this information has been out, even just if in my little insular world, it's been about 10 years that we've been talking about this now. And yet the inaction that's happened, we've proven without a doubt, for example, that sleep deprivation is hugely related. And like you said, the swing shifts, the days and the nights is the worst schedule on the planet because anyone that works those cannot regulate their circadian rhythm. In my profession, 56-hour work week. Again, look, our police officers work 40, our firefighters work 56. What the fuck is going on? Oh, but it's complicated. Oh, but it'll take... No. Why are they working 16 hours more than everyone else? So this is what, really is a call to action now. And I think that we're really seeing this. Like, I think politically we're seeing, like the person on the spinning wheel, the potter, the clay. When it gets off kilter slightly, that thing starts wobbling and then flies off into the wall on the side. That's what's happening now, because I think we're really starting to see who the good leaders are and who the charlatans are. And that could be nationally, or it could be at the head of a police or fire department, or the head of a union, whoever those people are. And so the ones with the set of balls, or a female version of, that are truly selflessly advocating for their people are the ones we need at the helms. And the ones that say, oh, I need to see studies. Oh, that'll never happen. Oh, we just don't have the budget. Need to step the fuck aside, because our men and women are dying every single fucking day. And enough is enough with this fucking cowardice. I'm so sick of it. The information is there. It's irrefutable. Now it's time for yours and my generation to step up and say, we're changing this.
Yeah, that's leadership. That's culture change, right? And that's hard. That's super hard, but that is their job. And unfortunately, not everyone's good at their job. We have some great leaders too. Like, I don't want to only kind of rip on management. We're very fortunate to have some fantastic leaders, but it just comes with setting that vision. And I mean, I cite, as far as schedules, I talk about the Vancouver police schedule. They have this rotating pattern where you do 4 consistent days, then 4 afternoons, then 4 evenings, then 4 nights, and one crew is just on early mornings. Right. So there is better ways. It's just, we have to be willing to try. We have to risk failure of some of them. And the default of not changing anything is what's easy. Easy mode is just show up, keep the status quo, rocking the boat, making changes, securing extra funding to pay for some of these things. That's what's hard. But we need those kind of leaders. And if you're going to lead like that in your organization, your people will go through a wall for you. Because I'll say I've had bad leaders and good leaders. And when it's a bad leader and they're saying, hey, I need you to stay late, I need you to work at 3 a.m. and blah, 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 I say, no, I'm not doing it. Why? Because you treat me terribly. So I'm not going to go the extra mile for you. Versus I have leaders, I'd do anything for them because they do anything for you. So I think that's what you're saying. And James, I appreciate your leadership on this. Like, I look up to you for what you've done. Look at what you've done between your books and your podcasts. Like, you really have advocated for this. You've really helped to spread a good message and help teach people about what they need to know. So keep the leadership that you're doing, because I think you're doing a fantastic job.
Well, I think just with it's all the people that care enough that I'm standing side by side with. I mean, to me, yeah, I would absolutely, it's leadership as well, but it's just connecting the dots. I mean, people like yourself who are advocating your profession, that have written an amazing book, just getting the person that needs it to the person that has it. I was just looking while you were talking then, this morning. Sorry, I've got the music playing there. There was a quote that popped up on my social media. It says, "The coward calls his chains peace and offers them to his children." Supposedly that's a Viking saying. The coward calls his chains peace and offers them to his children. So basically, apathy, doing nothing, passes on to the next generation, whether it's the next generation of cops or whether it's your own family, generational trauma. And so the only way you stop that is to have the courage to say enough is enough. And so that really resonated with me today. But, again, this isn't someone standing, holding a candle on their own. There's a community of people way ahead of us that already had the answers, the Gil Martins, like you said, all these people that we talked about. But it's now about disseminating this knowledge, getting people to understand, and then getting people to realize that they can change, empower them. And it's just the same thing I said with post-traumatic growth. This conversation shouldn't be a doom and gloom conversation. Whether you're struggling with your mental health or whether you just want to operate at the highest level and get in a flow state as a SWAT or ERT operator, it's the same thing. The healthy mind not only prevents you from going into a dark place, it allows you to operate at the highest level. So in my profession, that might be finding a kid in a building because my mind is clear, or it might be pushing the right drugs at 3 a.m. So, there is no downside to this other than having the courage to say the way we've done it isn't working. We need to find other ways. And the beautiful thing is people have already figured it out. All you've got to do is have the courage to actually enact that change.
Yeah. And I would say when that change happens, it's so slow, you often struggle to see it in the moment. But like I have friends who are firefighters, and over these last several years, they've switched from a 2 days, 2 nights to a 24/72. So I think we are seeing positive changes. It just feels so slow in the moment and so hard to see at times. But I think that's a part of what culture change can look like. And I think it's something we all will need to keep working on through our whole careers and our whole lives. And then we basically need to pass it on to the next generation and back even to families. Like that's my hope for my kids, is that I can take what I got, and I think I got pretty good from my family, and I hope I can give them a little bit better, a little bit of a better world, a little bit better upbringing, and just then hope to pass it on to them to try and make it better from there. And my hope is the same within the profession, that we'd mentor the next generation. I'm very fortunate. I've gone out to our national training center 4 times now to present to like an auditorium of our cadets, and just trying to normalize being healthy, and that it's an action. It's, you don't pass your physical once and now I did it, I ticked the box, I'm good. You need to be fit to do the job because the citizens rely on you, your partners rely on you. And one of the guys that does it with me, or has done it with me, he says, asking for help was the most courageous thing I've ever done. And that officer has done some absolutely insane things in his career, what he's been through, but yet asking for help was the most courageous thing. And I tell him, you coming here and saying that to these cadets makes it so they'll never have to say it one day. You're giving them permission to be human. You're giving them permission to ask for help. You're giving them permission to stay healthy. You're also setting the expectation to do it by modeling it for them. And James, I think that again comes back to what you're doing with your stuff. And again, it's what I'm trying to do. I think of it as just healing out loud. I'm not doing this because I need social media likes or I need to sell a book. I just found a way to help people with an asymmetrical use of time, which I think is what your podcast is, what your books are. It's instead of like being able to help people one-on-one in an organization with 20,000 cops, it feels like you're not doing enough, even though every time that matters. And my hope was to just put out resources in a way that I can help someone while I'm asleep or while I'm not there or who I've never met. And again, I think that's, leveraging technology to help on a bigger scale and create that culture change.
Absolutely. Well, your book is Setting My Sights on Stigma, Thoughts from an Injured Mind. What made you write the book, and then tell people listening what they can find between the covers?
Wow, thank you. It's the book I wish I had. It's the book I needed. I spent 4 years writing it. I did a master's degree studying this. I followed up with all the academic literature. I have about 10 years on a SWAT team, or emergency response, we call it up here in Canada, about 10 years of peer support. So compiling those anecdotal examples, the lived experience, the peer support, what, research journals and books. And you talked about Dave Grossman. He's a big source for my lethal force psychology chapter because he's awesome. And just then I tried to break it down into topics. What were the problems I faced? So for me, stigma was so huge. Police culture, lethal force psychology, emotional pain, right? I struggled with that, but I didn't understand it, especially as a man. Suicide, I share getting into like experiencing some thoughts of suicide without understanding it. My journey of post-traumatic growth, right? Post-traumatic stress, yes, being diagnosed. Yes, I got so bad I failed my psych exam, my first attempt at return to work psych exam, but then I got so much better. And some of these things will change us. You can't always go back to who you were, but it doesn't mean you can't find a newer, better version of yourself and change in positive ways. So I just broke down the book into these different chapters. I start with a story in every chapter to try and make it an engaging read and fun, and you can remember the story to teach the lessons. And then I share all these insights from different psychologists and the books that really helped me as I was healing. Even things like sleep science, that's my last chapter, sharing what it's like to have one of these nightmares from trauma. And then sharing all this whole whack of science from melatonin to prescription sleep meds to sleep hygiene, all the things that you can do. Right? My goal is that this is something that can help you. And for anybody who's debating whether you want to read it, you can go to my website, just my name, markbouchard.ca. It's Mark with a K. And then you can download it. You just put your email address in. I'm not going to spam you. I'm not looking to send you anything. I wrote it to help you, not to sell it to you. I've probably given away a few hundred copies myself. Because I know it's what I needed. I know so many people who did. Talked about some of these great books like Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. Well, there's nothing in there about sleep. There's nothing in there about trauma, right? And I wish that guys like Dave Grossman and guys like Kevin Gilmartin had written a book on some of these kind of things. And actually, Dave Grossman, I said this to him. I got to interview him once. And I told him, hearing him on a podcast talk about sleep was what motivated me to write a chapter about sleep, to compile all the best research I could find from Matthew Walker and Kirk Parsley, Nick Littlehales, and a bunch of these world-class experts, teach myself, and then try and pass it on to others. So my hope is that my book can help you. If anybody listening wants to reach out, you can find me on different social medias, or you can find me on my website. And I just want you to be happy, healthy, and be able to, take care of those around you, whether you're a first responder or whether it's your family.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank you so much, Mark. It's been such an amazing conversation. There's a lot of people that come on here, and for some of them, their mental health challenges that take them out of the profession. But to have you operating at a high level, going through this, finding your own unique toolbox of your healing journey, but then writing about this. And then again, I love the fact that you do touch on post-traumatic growth in the book. It's just so important. And as like you said, people say to me early on, when they would start podcasts, oh, I don't want to tread on your toes. I'm like, what are you talking about? The more of us that are out there giving a platform, talking about these things, the more chance that that's going to resonate with a particular person. And even with your book, like you said, there are some police mental health books already out there, but it's a completely different perspective. It's your perspective. And ironically, Dave Grossman was talking about sleep a lot in the most recent interview I did with him. So I want to thank you not only for your courageous vulnerability today, but for also what you're doing in the book, because it's an invaluable resource for people listening. And, this layer now of this conversation and the resources themselves, every single layer of that is saving more and more lives. So I want to thank you so, so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you, brother. It's been my honor and my pleasure. So thank you very much for having me.